I always know when Gary Levy's not here when I'm teaching because he's the one that gets a glass of water for the rabbis. All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Oh, you got your, yeah. All right. Well, I hope everyone is having a good Shabbat. And I don't know how many of you took my advice or my encouragement last week to, make that extra effort this Shabbat to set it apart from the rest of the week. But we will be getting into that a little later. If you were here last week, you recall that last week was only part one of a two-part teaching. So this morning's teaching is the continuation of that. Thank you.
Can't have the rabbis thirsty.
I think when we look at the tabernacle today, we're going to see, there is supposed to be an order and a sequence to things where everyone has their tasks, and shame on you. But anyway, so this morning's teaching is a continuation from last week, and it was entitled, as you can see up there, Preparing to Encounter the Holy. Now, for those who were not here last Shabbat, or for those who need a quick refresher of what was discussed, I'm going to quickly review what I think were the most important principles that were discussed, and that will continue to be significant in this week's teaching. So when we were looking at this question of how do we prepare to encounter the holy, we acknowledge that first and foremost, Scripture says that we are required to be holy, and the reason is because God is holy. And we talked about what holy actually means, that in Kodesh in Hebrew or the Agios in the Greek, that what holy means is that we're to be set apart, we're to be uncommon, we're to not be part of this world, just as God is set apart and not common. So are we to be this, we likewise are to be the same. We also talked about that although God desires to dwell among his people, and he's desired this since we lost that right to be in his presence back in the garden, there's a problem that arises for us humans when we encounter the holiness of God. Because we encounter him in our unholiness, or our commonness. And because we are common, we are unholy when we encounter God, our response is to respond in fear. And this is because when we encounter the holiness and the glory of God, it becomes immediately clear to us that we are marked by sin and death, and that we are weighed down by it. And so we looked at examples last week in the Scriptures. We looked at how when Moses encountered God in the burning bush, or even more so, or even before that, when Adam and Eve encountered God after they fell. We looked at how the children of Israel at the foot of Sinai responded to God's presence. And to make sure that it wasn't just thinking that's an Old Testament occurrence, that maybe things changed in the New Testament, we went to the book of Revelation and we looked at how even John, the disciple who Yeshua loved, that when he encountered the risen and ascended Christ in his full glory, that even he fell down in fear. And he felt death weighing upon him. Now, because this problem exists, that we're supposed to be holy, we're called to be holy, but we're not, at least not by our own merits. What God did to address this is first he established the tabernacle system, along with the priests and the sacrifices that went along with it. And we're going to look a lot at that today. But he did this so that he could dwell among the children of Israel. Because he knew that because they were a stiff-necked people, because they would continue to turn back to their former lives in Egypt, he knew that they would continue to fall into sin, and if that was the case, his wrath eventually would end up consuming them. So he creates this system of separation and of forgiveness that allows him to continue to dwell among the people without destroying them. And of course, this tabernacle system was a prefiguration of what Yeshua would accomplish in the eternal once and for all through his own incarnation, his crucifixion, and then his resurrection. And finally, last week, we acknowledged that as Yeshua's disciples, we have become a temple for the Spirit of God because of what he's done and through what he's done. But that's not a testimony now to our own holiness. But rather, in recognizing that we become the temple of the Holy Spirit, we should recognize that now there are new sets of requirements. There's almost a greater expectation that we be holy so as not to offend his Spirit and to cause it to depart. So having touched upon all of these points, trying to bring everyone back up to speed, we come to the question that I ended with last week is, how then do we today, as disciples of Yeshua, approach God's holiness? In other words, what must we do to prepare ourselves to enter into his holy presence? Those times that he has set apart, those spaces that he has set apart from the rest of the world so that we can have fellowship with him. Now, I had not originally planned, when I was thinking about where I was going to take this teaching last week, I had not originally planned to start this morning's teaching by addressing the torn curtain in the temple. I was eventually going to get to that. But as I was preparing for the teaching and I was looking at certain commentaries and watching some teachings on YouTube just to get different perspectives that are out there on this question of how do we approach the holiness of God, what I discovered, and while it was by no means was it common or was it the most prominent teaching out there, but there was this teaching that I encountered where the people seemed to be suggesting that Christians no longer had to concern themselves with being holy because Yeshua has given us complete and immediate access to God. That in essence, something changed through what Yeshua did, that we now, just by belonging to him, we're automatically holy, so we don't have to think about it anymore. We don't have to concern ourselves with it. And they looked at this, the torn veil, the rent curtain in the temple. They looked at that as kind of the evidence that they were giving up from the scriptures saying, God tore the veil, so now we have complete, free, immediate access to him. And I wanted to address this first because I think there is a grave mistake that these teachers are making in their understanding of exactly what that veil being torn in two represents to the disciples of Yeshua. Now, the specific event that I'm talking to, that these teachers are referring to, is found in Matthew 27, 50 through 51, which states,
"And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked and the rocks were split."
So that's the event. And it is described that as immediately as he yielded up the spirit, when he died on the cross, that veil in the temple was torn in two. And I'm in complete agreement with the teachings out there that this event shows us that when Messiah died on the cross, his sacrifice was accepted for the covering of sin and death, which in turn granted God's called out people access to them, or gave them an access to him that didn't exist prior to that event. And the fact that the veil tore from the top to the bottom, what that indicates is that it was God who was doing the tearing. He was tearing down this barrier that did exist between him and men. Because if it was man doing it, it would have been torn from the top up. Remember, this was a veil that was 30, 40 feet high, that hung in the temple. And so from the top down to the bottom, it was torn that way. That's the indication that this was God doing it. And this access to God that was achieved through Yeshua's sacrifice, this is explained in great detail in Hebrews. So we can't deny that that's what he was doing. And we're not going to read all of chapter 9 and 10 of Hebrews, where if you want a full understanding, you need to go to. But I want to read the select verses 9, 2 through 7, 11 through 14, 23 through 28, and then 10, 19 through 22, which says,
"For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary, and behind the second veil the part of the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. and above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Now when these things had been thus prepared, the priest always went into the first part of the tabernacle performing the services. But into the second part the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which is offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but of his own blood. He entered the most holy place for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of the heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Therefore it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with the better sacrifices than these. For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Not that he should offer himself often, as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood of another. He then would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world, but now once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Yeshua, by a new and living way, which he consecrated for us through the veil that is his flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water.
So in these verses we see how the scripture says that it says what Yeshua accomplished on the cross, and that he did provide those who belong to God, who belong to him, greater access to him. The access was given to his dwelling presence. That in the days of the tabernacle, when the Shekinah, that holy resting presence of God, rested behind the veil, above the ark. As we just heard there, that was a place only one person in the whole world could enter one time a year, and could only do so after a sacrifice was made for him, that he was already covered by a blood, blotting out his sin and iniquities. But Yeshua changes all of that, because no longer is it just one man that's given access. No longer is it is a requirement for a sacrifice every time one goes into it, because his sacrifice is on the eternal altar forever. So all of that is true. And so when these teachers say that now, Christians have this immediate access to God, that they don't have to really be concerned about the holiness anymore, because again, automatically, like, the holiness is imparted to all the Christians. It's true to a certain point. But when they get to that point of saying that obedience is not related to our holiness anymore, or if they contend that holiness has been imparted upon us by Yeshua, and therefore we don't have to do anything as it relates to holiness, this is where I would say they're gravely mistaken. And I believe they make these errors because they truly don't understand the tabernacle system and what the torn veil truly represents in the whole of the tabernacle. And the first thing I would ask any teacher, if they were present, and was teaching this, I would ask them, go back to the first century when Yeshua died on the cross. And when that physical veil in the temple was torn in two, who saw it, who physically saw it, and who all of a sudden had access to the Holy of Holies? Because the answer is not everyone. Just because that veil tears does not mean everyone now has access to God. In fact, if we think about the physical temple, or even go to the tabernacle in the wilderness, not even every Jew or Israelite had access to God just because that veil's rent. Not even every Levite had access because the veil's rent. Instead, it would have only been granted access to the priests. Because when that veil is torn and the Holy of Holies becomes exposed, it's only exposed to the holy place. And actually, could you pull up the next slide? I've got a slide. We're going to use this. There should be a slide of the tabernacle. There we go. So this is a diagram of what the tabernacle system looked like. And this is primarily looking at the tabernacle system as it was, that was constructed under the guidance of Moses in the wilderness. Because the temples after that, while they were much grander and larger, they were all built on this same model, this same system. And so, if you look on the left side of it, you see the Holy of Holies, and you see the kind of pink magenta line there that represents the veil. So again, we tear that down, where we tear it in two, and all of a sudden the Holy of Holies become exposed. The only thing that has access to it is the holy place, because that is an enclosed place itself. If you're outside the holy place, even if you're in the outer courtyard or the area surrounding it, you still don't see the Holy of Holies. You're still not given access, immediate access to the Spirit of God when that veil's rent. And the only people who could go through the door into the actual tent there, into the tabernacle, the holy space, were the Kohanim, the priests. Again, even the Levites, the other Levites who had certainly services to render, they couldn't enter into that area. That's how God constructed it. There's many other separations in the tabernacle system between God and man. Ones that only the Kohanim, that meaning the descendants of Aaron in the physical, could access. When the veil's torn in two, it gave access to the Holy of Holies only from the holy place, where the Kohanim ministered before the Lord. Again, even the Levites were restricted to the outer courtyard. And of course, the non-Kohanim and the Israelites, who were in the outer court, who there to offer sacrifices on the altar of burnt offering, the brazen altar, has many names, they still would not have seen the presence of God here. And of course, this says nothing about the people even beyond the outer boundary, that first perimeter that existed in the system. We can go back to the verses. We'll come back to that later on, because we're going to go through each of those items as you progress towards the access of God in the second half of this teaching. But once we realize this fact that when the veil is torn in two, it only exposes God's presence to the holy place, we can better understand that our obligations to be holy having now been given access to God. For the obligations and the restrictions of the priests are greater than that of the Levites, which is greater than that of the rest of the Israelites, which is greater than that of the non-Israelites, because of their proximity to service to God. Now, of course, as we discussed last week, we, the saints, those who are disciples of Yeshua, who, whether you go by the name Messianic, Christian, whatever title you give yourself, the saints, meaning the set-apart ones, we know, though, that we ourselves are now part of a priesthood, and that we serve under our high priest, Yeshua. As a reminder, we find this in 1 Peter 2:9 that states,
"But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light."
Therefore, if we are priests, we're now part of this royal priesthood. And remember, in Hebrews, the writer talks about how this priesthood is even a greater priesthood than the Levitical priesthood. But we need to take seriously how those former priests of the tabernacle system were set apart from the rest of the people. And we need to do this not so much because we are held to the same physical restrictions and obligations that they are, but because it helps us to understand our need to be and to remain spiritually pure in the eyes of God through obedience, and actually through work, through service. And as we'll get into this later. Don't confuse this as meaning salvation. And I'm going to show you how the tabernacle system shows this later in the teaching. But what I'm talking about here is like what happens after salvation. We're all saved through the sacrifice of Yeshua. And there's nothing we can do to merit that salvation. It's a free gift. But what about our walk? Does it just end? Are we just in the outer court forever, content to be there? Or are there ways to get closer access to God? And that's what we're focusing on. And that's why looking at the priests and the tabernacle system in the physical can help us better understand our obligations in the spiritual. Now, I'm not going to take time this morning to read through all those additional instructions and all those restrictions and those obligations that were given exclusively to the Kohanim. But if you're interested, if you're on your own, you want to study that, you want to get a good sense of that, I would encourage you to read Leviticus 10, 8 through 20, and Leviticus chapter 21, because that's where you get a lot of those instructions. But in all of those instructions, you find in those chapters, what's the underlying principle there is that God was setting the priests who would serve in that inner court or in that holy place. He was setting a fundamental principle down that we find in Leviticus 10 through 11 that says,
that you may distinguish between holy and unholy, between unclean and clean, and that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses.
So in all these instructions and all these restrictions and obligations, what God is doing is he's saying the Kohanim are to be set apart, to be holy, but set apart even to a greater degree, like I said, than the rest of the Levites, the rest of the Israelites. But part of the reason they're set apart, there is services that they're doing in the tabernacle, but it's also here, it's clear, it's saying that the Kohanim are there to teach the Torah to Israel. It's their responsibility to make sure that the Torah is taught to the rest of the Israelites. And as we talked about last week, the Torah itself is the instructions that set apart all of Israel from the rest of the nations. The Kohanim need to be more holy because they were to teach the rest of the Israelites, the rest of the camp of God, how to be holy from the rest of the nations, set apart. It says they're distinguished between the holy and the unholy. Meaning that the priests were expected to follow the instructions that God gave to them perfectly. Service in the holy place was of the utmost seriousness because of their proximity to the presence of God. There was no room there that afforded them to improvise, to come up with their own personal interpretations of how they were to do the service. Also, they were not to go into it just half-hearted, saying, okay, it's my turn again, we'll just go through the motions, okay, I'll lay out the showbread, I'll make sure, the high priest goes in, I'll make sure the lamp is the wicks are fine and burning, there's enough oil in it. It's not that it's to become routine. This was the most serious of matters here. And it required their full attention to make sure that they were following the instructions of God clearly. I feel like I almost kind of experienced this morning. Again, last week at the end of the teaching, you know that I gave you encouragement to try to make this Shabbat more set apart than you typically do, to make that extra effort. And I think I was more sensitive because in our house we were doing the very same thing. And usually, on Shabbat mornings, it's always a rule in our house, no secular music in the house on Shabbat. If there's any music, it has to be praise and worship music. And Hyla likes to listen to music on Shabbat mornings, and usually that means she goes to she finds Lauren Daigle worship songs, and she listens to them. But she said, Dad, I know a different song. I have a different song that I want to play. And I said, as long as it's about God, that's fine. So she puts it on, and immediately this doesn't sound like praise and worship music to me. It had some modern hip hop beat to it and everything. And I'm here this doesn't sound like that, Hyla. You got to change it. She's like, no, just listen. So I was listening to the words, and certainly the song was about a person worshiping God. But, as I'm listening to it, I'm troubled the whole time by it because first, and again, and I try to be sensitive, like, okay, I don't like modern hip hop music. Maybe this is just my own taste, thinking this is not a right way to worship God. But then, I'm listening to the words, but the words aren't about giving praise to him. It wasn't about glorifying him. It was about the singer, about how great it, like what I receive from the worship. And we do receive a lot of great blessings and benefits from good, pure worship. But then the line that did it for me, and it was probably because I was sensitive, because again, we were making the Shabbat more separate, and I put this teaching together, so I'd been reading and studying all week about the Kohen, was the line went, I'm going to get my worship on. First of all, I don't even know what that means. But that it grated on me. I was like, nope, turn it off. It goes off immediately. Because it was this frivolousness that I felt in the song about worship. And again, and there was this, it was almost like we're improvising here, or we're just going with what feels good to us, is my own personal interpretation of it. Rather than realizing, if you're going to worship God as close as you can into his presence, there's an order to it. There is structure to it that he's established, and we need to be obedient and walk in that. And we see in the scriptures that when the priests would not walk in those instructions, when they would decide to improvise, when they would decide to do things on their own, the consequences were fatal. We see in Leviticus 10, 1-7, the following.
Then Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. And Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people I must be glorified. So Aaron held his peace. Then Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Uzziel, the uncle of Aaron, and said to them, come near, carry your brethren from before the sanctuary out of the camp. So they went near and carried them by their tunics out of the camp, as Moses had said. And Moses said to Aaron and to Eleazar and Ithamar, his sons, do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, lest you die and wrath come upon all the people. But let your brethren, the whole house of Israel, bewail the burning, which the Lord has kindled. You shall not go out from the door of the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die, for the anointing oil of the Lord is upon you. And they did according to the word of Moses.
Now, when we read the verses here, we read this text, we don't know exactly what Nadab and Abihu did. What did they offer to God that made it a strange or an unfamiliar fire? And there's a lot of guesses to what it was. One is, if you read a couple verses after the passage we laid out, that Brian just read, all of a sudden God gives an instruction that the priests are not to drink alcohol. And so some commentators wonder, well, did they go in there drunk? Was that the problem? Others, though, feel that the fact that it's the fire that's called strange and unfamiliar is that they weren't following. God had given specific instructions on what was the incense, because this occurred not in the outer court, it occurred in the inner court, in the holy place. And there's the altar of incense there, and that they had they were burning some incense on there that was not what God had instructed to do. And there's an argument in many of the commentators that they probably created their own incense, because the instructions of that incense comes right before this instant. And it may have been that Moses or Aaron had not had the time to actually make the incense yet, to mix the right spices and herbs together to make the incense. So they just went in with this common incense, burned it, and that was the offense to God. If you take that second idea that they brought in their own incense, and they were doing it, especially if they became impatient, they didn't want to wait for the proper incense to be created by the instructions of God. The argument then becomes that what they were actually doing was they were acting out of almost like a zeal. There was an exuberance. They were excited about their service in the holy place to God, and they didn't want to wait. They wanted to get in there and wanted to do it right away. But if that's the case, If that's truly what happened, and again, we can't say definitively 100% that is, but there's a good chance that was at least part of it, what it shows the seriousness we need to take God's holiness and his instructions around it. Our zeal, if it's guided by just our own feelings, our own interpretations, our own understandings, even if we mean the best, even if it's well-intentioned, that's not sufficient. Intentions and feelings aren't going to get it done. We have to follow his commandments and his guidance specifically as he laid it out. And when you read the rest of that story there, you kind of see that they get it. I mean, think about it. Aaron, it says that, when it was explained what happened, Aaron held his peace. It's like, I have nothing to say. They were guilty, in essence. I couldn't make an argument against God for doing it. But even think then, even further, how the priests had to still remain separate. Because at this point, Aaron and there's his 4 sons, so you have 5 priests at this point that can actually go in there and administer the service into the holy place. They just lost 2 of them. And if you're Aaron, it's your sons. If it's the other 2 priests, it's your brothers. And God had said, you're not allowed to mourn for your family. Outside the tabernacle, the camp of Israel is to mourn for what's happened. But because you're in service to me, again, your feelings have to kind of be put aside. You are coming close, very close, as close as you can get, still separated by the veil though at this point, to the presence of God, and therefore God has laid out the expectations, the instructions, the obligations, the restrictions that you must follow completely. We find a similar instance of this occurring, not among the priests, but among the Levites, later in Scripture, when we see that they took it upon themselves under the direction of David to act, again, with great zeal, but not in accordance with his commandments when they wanted to bring the ark to Jerusalem. Because they weren't in accordance with the commandments, they end up making their actions common. Their actions are no longer holy. It wasn't set apart. What I'm referring to is what we read about in 2 Samuel 6, 2-9 that states,
And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called by the name the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. So they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, accompanying the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. Then David and all the house of Israel played music for the Lord, on all kinds of instruments, of fir wood, on harps, on stringed instruments, on tambourines, on sistrums, and on cymbals. And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God. And David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah, and he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me?
So Uzzah is struck down because he reaches out and he touches the ark, but he did so in order to make sure that he was worried he was going to tip over and fall. And on the surface, in the common, that appears to be a good thing. You have the Ark of the Covenant, which is the most holy and sacred object of the entire tabernacle system in all of Israel. Because this is where, when God's presence would fill the Holy of Holies, this is where the Shekinah rested. It was above the Ark. And it was that was the place where, when the high priest did get to go in once a year, that he would sprinkle the blood on the seat of propitiation for the sins of all of Israel. So this is the object where that occurs. So you would think, your natural reaction, if you love God, you think would be to reach out and hold it. You don't want to see that holy artifact fall over, open up, the contents spill out. You don't want to see it get damaged or, touching just common unholy ground become perhaps profaned. But yet when he does this, he's struck dead by God. Why? Well, the problem actually, you got to take a couple steps back and actually see what the full problem is here. And unfortunately, it does go back to David. Because David and those moving the ark, they were doing it in zeal. They wanted to bring the ark up to Jerusalem. They were doing it out of a desire to be closer to God and to glorify God. But in their zeal, they began moving the ark not according to the commandments of God. And thus, they were failing to distinguish between the holy and the holy, just as Nadab and Abihu had done. The ark should have never been placed on a cart in the first place, thus putting it in a position of jeopardy. After all, God had given specific commandments of how the ark was to be transported. We see it in Exodus 25:12-14, and Numbers 7-9.
You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in its 4 corners. 2 rings shall be on one side, and 2 rings on the other side. And you shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark, that the ark may be carried by them. But to the sons of Kohath he gave none, because theirs was the service of the holy things, which they carried on their shoulders.
So when God commanded the construction of all, not just the ark, but all of the instruments and objects in the tabernacle, all of them were built with these rings on them. It's because no one was to touch them. And instead, there were poles that were created that you slid through, and it fell to the clan of Kohath. This is one of the Levite clans, that they alone were to transport, by carrying the poles, they were to transport the ark and the other objects. But because David and his men were acting in zeal to bring the ark to Jerusalem, they neglected God's instructions here. Instead, they put it on a cart that is being pulled by the oxen. And therefore, cart wobbles, the ark becomes endangered, Uzzah's there, and then he violates God's instructions that we see in Numbers 4-15.
And when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is set to go, then the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them. But they shall not touch any holy thing, lest they die. These are the things in the tabernacle of meeting, which the sons of Kohath are to carry.
And when we see this, and we think about all these instructions, we can understand when we read the 2 Samuel 6:2-9, the last verse there, it said David was afraid of the Lord that day. I think it struck David. He realized the mistake he had made. That in his zeal, again, however well-intentioned it was, he had neglected God's instructions. And because of that, he now had just witnessed the judgment of death that falls upon those who experience the holiness of God without following his instructions. But David learns from this error, because the next time he attempts to move the ark, it appears as though he then made sure that they were following God's instructions. 2 Samuel 6:13 states.
And so it was, when those bearing the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, that he sacrificed oxen and fatted sheep.
It says those bearing the ark of the Lord. It doesn't say who it was, but it's not on a cart anymore. It's not being borne by animals, but there are men, and the assumption is that it would have been of the clan of Kohath among the Levites. They are now bearing the ark. They're doing it in the correct way. So these instances show that even among those who have the greatest access to God, obedience to his instructions is essential in their service before him, because his holiness must remain set apart from what is common or what is unholy. And I would actually argue that the expectation for obedience is even greater for those who are closer to God, because they are expected to be set apart to even a greater extent than those who are farther away. And once we begin to see our access to God through Yeshua's sacrifice as being part of our having been brought into the royal priesthood, therefore being brought closer to God, that we now have been brought into the inner court of the tabernacle by becoming part of that priesthood, we now also have access to that Holy of Holies, because the curtain has been torn. But it's only because we've entered into this priesthood as disciples of Yeshua. But this helps us begin to understand then our need for Torah obedience. The writer of Hebrews himself recognizes this when he writes after his declaration that Yeshua has provided us access to God. He says the following in Hebrews 10:23-29.
Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of others together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. For if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and fiery indignation, which will devour the adversaries. Anyone who has rejected Moses' law dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much worse punishment do you suppose will he be thought worthy who was trampled the Son of God underfoot, counted the blood of the covenant by which was sanctified a common thing, and insulted the Spirit of grace?
So the writer here is encouraging those who now have access to the Holy of Holies, because Yeshua has made that possible, that they now have access to the resting presence of God. He says, you've got to hold fast in your faith. You can't be swayed to the left or the right. He says you are responsible for provoking your other brothers and sisters, the other members of the priesthood that you belong to. You're to provoke them to what? Good works. Not to right believing. That's already assumed, but to good works. And he says you're not to forsake the assembly, because you're supposed to be there to encourage your brothers and sisters to persist in their good works. Then he turns and warns that those who continue to sin willfully in this state, if you've been given access to God because the veil's been torn, if you continue to sin willfully, you will face judgment because you're now beyond the sacrifice of Yeshua. There's nothing left. If the sacrifice of Yeshua doesn't cover your sins and turn you towards obedience, there's nothing left. There's no other backup to doing that. So there's a grave warning here to those people. This is all part of the obligations we take on by becoming priests under the high priest of Yeshua. So with all this in mind, I want to turn now to the tabernacle structures and the instruments that establish the boundaries to set people apart from God's holiness. But we're also going to look at what means did God establish in that physical tabernacle for certain people to move beyond those boundaries. So if we want to flip back over to the diagram that we have there. All right, so again, God's presence is resting there above the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. So that's the closest you can get to God. So we're going to start on the right side of the diagram, which represents kind of the farthest from God. And actually kind of outside that white perimeter represents the farthest from God. But we see to approach God, there is a series of steps. There is a succession that he's established that's necessary in order to do this. So if we were in the camp of we could even go out further, because we have to if you zoomed out farther from here, and again, we're thinking about the wilderness experience. Immediately surrounding even this is the camps of the Levites, those who did service in the related to the tabernacle. And then beyond them are the 12 tribes of Israel, and they're encamped around it. And then beyond that is the wilderness, it's the nations. So even there's already a distinguishing as you approach towards it. But we're going to start here with the actual tabernacle system. And we see there on the right, well, I guess the first we see is there's a wall of white around it. And in the tabernacle days, this was a wall of white linen that you would have seen. And the white is there to represent that there's a pureness to all of this, and that it is there to represent the holiness of God. So already once you pass beyond that first barrier, you are now in a more holy place, and as distinguished by that white linen. And as you see, there's only one gate to enter into the outer court. You don't get to pick and choose how you approach God. You don't get to pick and choose where you enter into the tabernacle place. There's only one gate that allows you to enter into that outer court. Now, as long as you were part of the children of Israel, you could enter into that. There were no restrictions on entering into it, though the assumption typically was if you're going in there, if you're not a Levite, you're only going in there to make a sacrifice to God. There really is no other reason for you to be in there. But when it talks about how the children of Israel would assemble before the tent of meeting, before the tabernacle, it's right outside that entrance gate where they would assemble, and Moses would usually address. That's where Moses would stand where he would address them. But again, it's important that we recognize there's only one gate. There's only one way to access God here. Similarly, we know that through Yeshua, that he is the only way to access God. There is no other way. There is no other means. Yeshua is that gate, that entrance gate there. If you're even just to enter into the outer court, it can only be done through Yeshua. And we see Yeshua making references to this even when he says in John 10:9,
I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture.
and John 14:6.
Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
So just as you can only enter into this through the entrance gate, you can only begin to enter to God's presence through Yeshua. That gate was always left open. There was never a time it was closed. And likewise, Yeshua is there now for all time until the day of judgment, till the era of grace ends. It is there open for anyone to be able to enter, but it has to be through Yeshua. Now, once you enter into the outer court, what's the first thing you encounter there? It's the altar of burnt offerings, sometimes called the brazen altar or the bronze altar. Now, this is where, again, especially if you're not a Levite, where you have services, or priest, where you have services performed, this is essentially the only place you go. So if you're of one of the other tribes, you only ever really get as far as the brazen altar. And this is where you would have brought your sacrifices to God. So as soon as you enter in, that first burial, you've entered in closer to God, you come to the place of sacrifice. And so we see that as soon as we enter through Yeshua into God, the first thing that's required is we need a sacrifice. That first step requires that we make a sacrifice if we're to remain there. Otherwise, eventually that holiness of God, we're going to start to feel that mark of sin and death on us. We're going to start to feel weighed down by it. So we're there to make a sacrifice. The sins that you carried in when you came through that door, they've got to be blotted out in God's presence. That needs that blood covering to be upon them. And that's why the first thing you do is you have to make that sacrifice. You need that blood to be shed, Leviticus 17:11 says. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. Only by the shedding of blood can you find that atonement literally pitching over and covering of the sins. Now, of course, we know as we approach God, once we enter through Yeshua, we know that Yeshua is that sacrifice for us. John 1:29 says.
The next day, John saw Yeshua coming toward him and said, Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world.
Now, if you know the tabernacle system, you know the sacrificial system, of course you also know that sin sacrifices weren't the only offerings made. There were things such as gift offerings, thanksgiving offerings, burnt offerings, and so on. But underpinning all of those sacrifices are on the foundation of sin being forgiven. The burnt offering, remember the burnt offering had to be given twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. And all the other sacrifices of that day were put on top of the burnt offering. And the burnt offering covers sin as well. So even when you bring the other sacrifices in, all of it relates to the covering of one's sins as they approach God. And this is important because not only does the sacrifice and the shedding of the blood in the sacrifice cover our sins, but it was fundamentally understood the sacrifice that you brought, especially think about a gift offering or a Thanksgiving offering. You're bringing that in order to have fellowship with God. The sacrifice represents a meal that you sit down and you partake with God. This is part of how you enter into his presence. You are having fellowship between God and you. Now you need the priest there to actually make the sacrifice as the mediator between you two. So there's actually 3 people involved in that. Much like Yeshua is our sacrifice, but at the same time he's also the mediator between God and us. in all of this so that we can have fellowship with them, with God. So all's good. If you only make it to the altar of burnt offerings, the brazen altar, your sins are forgiven, the sacrifice has been made, and Yeshua is that eternal sacrifice now, and you can have fellowship with God, because you can sit down, you can partake in a meal with him. But, as you can see, there's a lot more to go. But the problem is many disciples of Yeshua today, that's where they stop. They never go beyond that. They remain in the outer court. Simply, God, what Yeshua did, he did it was once and for all, which is true. There's nothing I can do to merit salvation, that's true. But then never asking the next question, well, now that I am saved, what's expected of me? And that's what the rest of the system shows us. And this is where there's a great need to take that next step, to go to the bronze laver. Now, the bronze laver was a giant pool of water in like a brass basin. And this was only used by the priests. So it's only those who have a reason to perform services to God. Though when they would go into into the Holy of Holies, they would have to wash themselves there. But even before they would start offering sacrifices on the brazen altar, they would go and they'd wash, they'd cleanse themselves there as well. So this is used by the priest. But again, remember, we are now part of a royal priesthood. So this does apply to us. And we should be taking that approach to the bronze laver. And it's necessary for us to go to that bronze laver if we're to enter into service to God. After the sacrifice, after that our sins have been covered, if we want to really get into true service and really into deep, true worship, we have to go to the bronze laver. And we have to recognize that obedience is going to be necessary. What the laver I'll show you here in a few minutes is the laver helps us see where we are still not being obedient, where we're still having to work on improving our walk with God and to wash further. And so obedience is essential. Again, keep in mind, this is after the sacrifice. This is after the cross. But we have to prepare ourselves to serve God. Ephesians 2:10 suggests this.
For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them.
So when the priests would approach, again, they would wash their hands and they would wash their feet. Both was required. And if you think about it, what does that symbolize? Well, the washing of hands is you cleansing what you've done. All the acts that you have carried out, the washing of the hands is to make sure that they are clean, that anything you've done that was unclean before you come to serve before God, that's washed away. Your feet represents where you've been, where you've gone. And if you've gone into common unholy places, you need to have that washed away as well. So there's the washing away of this. But at the same time, the laver acts as this huge mirror. Because it's in that bronze basin, when you would look into it, you would see a reflection of yourself. And the laver, as we approach the laver now in the spiritual, this is the time for self-examination. When I challenged you last week to set this Shabbat apart more than you typically do to make an effort, we went to the laver. We were looking in. I was asking you to look in the laver, look at how you observe the Shabbat, and see where can I do better. Where can I wash away some of that stuff that's still on me that isn't in complete obedience to God. The laver is the time for self-examination. James 1:22-25 says,
But be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does.
Now last week, the other thing I suggested, and this is all relates to the laver as well, one of the things I suggested that you do, and I hope all of you did it, is that when you pull into the parking lot this morning, I said you should say a prayer before you come in. And that prayer should be about kind of taking stock of where you're at this morning. And is there anything that I'm carrying with me? Sadness, depression, anger, a grudge, anything that is not something that's holy, that was not something you should really be bringing with you when you approach God, that you pray that God remove that from you, that you're going to cast those burdens onto God so that you don't bring those feelings into here. In essence, leave that baggage on the outside, out the door. What I was encouraging you to do is look into that labor, look at your reflection, what do you see, and wash it off. Wash off anything that is not of God. And it's important to recognize that we really have to be careful about our mood and our feelings and when we think about serving and worshiping God. It's not to say that, when you do worship God and you come to His presence, you're not going to feel joy and happiness and bless and all these great emotions and feelings that are going to come wash over you. But you have to, again, if I'm going to go into worship, I got to check all those negative feelings. I got to check all those feelings of the flesh that are going to distract me. And I got to wash them away before I enter into it. And I can't let how simply I feel that day dictate how deep I'm going to go into worship or how deep I'm going to go into my service with God. It's a lot like loving your spouse. I think we can all, if we're all honest, we can acknowledge that as we go through the years of marriage, there are peaks and there's valleys in certain aspects. Perhaps your affection, your appreciation, your friendship, even just how well you're communicating. There's times that everything is just clicking perfectly, everything's really good. And there's other times that may be more dry, where maybe, you go through a period where, you're a little more testy with each other. These are things, what I call affection, appreciation, and friendship. They wax and wane. Those are three types of loves. And those do go up and down. But those should not affect your love for your spouse. That should remain consistent throughout, regardless of how those other feelings are. Because loving your spouse is that act of love. It's actually doing something and showing the love, demonstrating the love, getting to the agape love where you sacrifice yourself for the benefit of the other because you love them. That should remain steady regardless of how you're feeling any other way. In the same way, when we come to worship and to serve God, we have to be steady. We have to keep on that even keel. And we have to not let the waxing and waning of those other feelings and emotions prevent us from serving God as He's commanded, as He's instructed, and how someone who truly is in love with God and wants to be in His presence, we truly should be feeling. So we need to go through the laver. Once we do that, as the priests, we now come to the door of the holy place. It's another barrier, and it's much like that, the first one, the entrance gate. This is a passageway. But it is different. It's different in that it's not always open. The curtains or the veil, the linens that covered that, they remain draped, and the priest has to push it aside. It's not like in the front where the veils were pulled apart. And there was a screen that veiled. So if you're walking outside the entire tabernacle system, and you pass by the entrance gate, you could look in and you could see what's going on. You can see the sacrifices being made and everything. If you're in the outer court, you can't look into the holy place just by standing there at the altar or looking or passing by it, because there's a veil there, and it was a veil made of threads that prevented you from being able to see into it, because only the priest could enter into that holy place to serve God. But similarly to how the entrance gate, Yeshua is the only way into that, likewise, Yeshua is the door here as well. He's the only way that one can pass into the holy place. And this holy place that we're going to talk about here now, it is completely set apart from everything else, and everything in it represents that. When we look at the linens that covered, not just there at the door, but surrounded the whole, the four sides there. The instructions of God look so that as I read it, I think I understood that it looks inward, is there was the image of the cherubim was to be woven into the fabric. And there was actually 4 layers of different fabrics and different animal skins that protected this holy place, that set it apart, that protected the holy place and set it apart. The most inner one, though, was the fine linen, and in that linen was these images of cherubim. And the cherubim, if you remember last week, they're associated with the holiness of God. The cherubim are the ones who kind of mark that barrier between the common and the uncommon when it comes to that presence of God. In the throne room, they're the ones who surround the throne and cry out continuously, holy, 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 Kodesh, Kodesh, Kodesh. Even think about the garden when Adam and Eve were separated from God's presence and they were driven out of the garden. God set a seraphim there with the blazing sword to guard to make sure that they couldn't come back into it. The seraphim represent that separation. Now inside the holy place, the priests are there to do service, and that's it. One thing that's pointed out in many of the commentaries is that, there is no place to sit down. There is no place to rest. There is no place for the priest in there to just relax in the presence of God. They are in there to do 2 things, to carry out the services that God mandated and to worship. And that's it. Now, when you first enter into, you go through the door, you go into the holy place, immediately you're between 2 objects. On one side is the table of the showbread, sometimes called the table of the presence. And on the table, every Shabbat, once a week, the priest laid out 12 loaves of bread on it, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the Torah itself actually uses challah as the word for the bread. So it doesn't indicate specifically was it unleavened or leavened bread. It doesn't use chametz or any specific words, it just uses challah. But at least Josephus, writing in the 1st century, claimed that it was unleavened bread that was laid out in the temple. And that makes a lot of sense because you're in the holy place. And because the leaven represents sin, this is to represent the 12 tribes of Israel free from sin. So it makes complete sense that it probably was unleavened bread. It was matzah that was laid out there. Now, the priests were permitted to eat this bread, but it would be at the end of the week. So it lays there for a week, and then they would be able to eat, and they were expected to eat of it. But again, they couldn't do it while they were sitting. It was part of what they were to eat as they served God. Now, opposite the table of the showbread then is the menorah, the lampstand. We all can picture it with the 7 prongs and everything. So if the showbread represents the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes, maybe purged of sin, probably purged of sin, represented by that bread, the lampstand represents God. We think about the 7 candle holders, the 7 spirits of God. And we know that when in John's vision in Revelation, when he saw Yeshua, that he walked among the lights, he walked among the lampstands. And of course, this is what illuminated the entire holy place, the light, the fires that were burning on the menorah there. So just as God is the light of the world, as Yeshua was the light of the world, we see that represented here as this. And again, this is the only light source in the Holy of Holies. There is no sun, there is no sunlight, there's no moonlight, starlight that ever penetrates that, because again, there was 4 layers of veil that enclosed it. You had the fine linens, and then you had you had the skin of I think it was goat skin, the skins of bullocks, and then the King James translated as badgers. I don't know exactly what animal is being referred to there, but there was all these layers, so light didn't penetrate into this area, that natural light from the sun and moon. The only light in this holy place is the lampstand, meaning it is God. And so what we see here in the holy place is almost a picture of what John saw in the New Jerusalem. where the 12 tribes of Israel dwell in the presence and the light of God. And it says in the New Jerusalem, there is no moon, sun, or stars, because there's no need because God's presence will provide the light. So when they would enter into this service, into this holy place, they in essence were moving into a representation of what it will be like in Olam Haba, what it was like in the garden before Adam and Eve fell. Now beyond this, we get to the altar of incense, or what's sometimes known as the golden altar. This was not an altar for sacrifices. Sacrifices are way out front. This was an altar to burn incense. And as I mentioned when I was talking about Nadab and Abihu, God had given instructions for a very unique mixture of spices to be burned, to be in the incense that burned on this altar. We actually don't know what that is. When we read it in Torah, we don't know what all the items are specifically referring to. Something we can't recreate. But this was an incense. It was understood that this incense is only to be used on this altar, this mixture. So not only could you not bring other incenses into the holy place to offer it, but you're not to take that incense and burn it somewhere else in the camp. It is set aside there. It's offered only by a priest, and it's understood. Well, it's offered by a priest whose sins have been forgiven. They've already had their sacrifices. They've already gone through the laver and everything. They've been cleansed there. And they've entered into service through Yeshua. They've entered into the holy place. And so they've done all that. They've gone past the altar, the laver, through the door. They're in the holy place. And the purpose of this incense is to create a fragrance before God of pure worship and pure love. This worship is only made possible, though, by Yeshua. And this is even seen in the physical because the coals that burned there, when they lit the fire, you couldn't light the fire in the holy place. What you had to do is go take the incenser out to the altar of burnt offerings, to the brazen altar, get the lit coals there where the sacrifices occurred and everything, and you would bring it in to here, and then you would burn the incense on top of those coals. And the incense was to burn at all times. There was never to be a point where this incense wasn't burning. And we get an image of this incense before God, this altar before God, and that in that incense, it is a raising up of our worship and our prayers and our praises and our love to God. We get an image of this in Revelation 8, 3-4, which says,
Then another angel, having a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, with the prayers of the saints, ascended before God from the angel's hand.
Then finally, beyond that, of course, we get to the veil and the Holy of Holies. In the past, this separated God from the priests. And again, only the high priest could go beyond it once a year on God's ordained day. And there's a whole series of sacrifices and atonements and washings and preparation he had to do before he could enter into that place. Now that veil, as we've been reading, what Yeshua did is he tore that in two, though. So therefore, God's presence becomes approachable, but only to the priests in there again, to the ones who are doing service to God. Meaning, their sins have been forgiven by the sacrifice out on the altar. They've entered into the holy place as an act of service and worship, having self-examined themselves to make sure to wash off and correct and so walk more closer in obedience to God. And they entered in there again to serve and to worship, because my guess is you still would not have, when the veil is torn, now maybe in the temple it would be a little different because it's a much larger scale. But if we're in the tabernacle and the veil is torn, you're probably still not getting a full, clear image of the holy place and the ark. And the reason I say that is because what's before it? The veil's gone, it's brought aside, what's before it? You still have the altar of incense, and you have that smoke from the incense burning and filling the place. And this isn't a large open area. This is kind of a confined place when we think about it in the tabernacle system in the wilderness. So you do have access to God, but your praise and your worship and your service is all there still between you and God. That's the only thing that allows you to be in that direct, immediate presence of Him. Because there in the Holy of Holies above the ark is where God's Shekinah is resting. It's His resting seat. It's where His presence truly on earth dwells. Now, this overview of the tabernacle, it's taken some time, but it's actually not even exhaustive. And you could actually go into much deeper study than what time gives this morning. Because there's many aspects of the system that I've not covered, which would add even more details about how we think about our approach to the holiness of God. Missing in this is that what I've not covered is an exploration of the different types of sacrifices that were offered on the brazen altar and the significance of each of those different sacrifices. We haven't talked about every role that the priest, and specifically the high priest, fulfilled. And we haven't examined every single instrument or the priestly garments that they had to wear that were all part of this tabernacle system. Nevertheless, I'm hopeful that this look at each of the major components or the major spaces of the tabernacle, starting from the farthest that was physically away from God's presence, moving into the closest, that this will lead you to consider how you need to approach Him and how you need to approach His sacred spaces and His sacred times. Whether it be His Shabbat like this morning, it be His annual feast, if it would be coming together for a corporate worship or a corporate prayer service, if it's your own individual worship and prayer service, or even when you go to study and to read His Word, you are approaching the holy, and you need to think about all of this. And the biggest thing, because the sacrifice is there on the altar, we have that assurance, but before you ever approach, every time you think about approaching God, take a look in the laver. Make sure you examine yourself in the laver before you go into these holy time, these holy places, or even into worship, prayer, and reading His Word. Last week's encouragement to make a greater effort to set apart the Shabbat, like I said earlier, was an effort to get us to peer into that mirror of the laver and to consider what we need to wash away as we prepare ourselves to enter into the door of the holy place and to worship God on His holy Shabbat. And if you made this effort, I'm certain that this Shabbat has been different from other ones, that it feels different. And I hope you've discovered many benefits and blessings, or you will yet even this afternoon up until sundown. You'll discover the benefits and blessings that result when we do make a greater effort to set apart the Shabbat or to set apart any time with God. Furthermore, it may have even taught you something about yourself, even beyond the Shabbat, where you need to wash yourself in the laver in order to serve and to worship God more completely. One of the suggestions I had made last week was about turning off electronics. Get no television, get your mobile phones turned off at least, don't access the videos and the social media, turn off the video games, whatever else it is. This one had a great impact on me for two reasons. First of all, there was definitely a greater silence in our house last night. And this morning until Hyla got up, and then kids make noise. You can't help that, but that's okay. But just the fact that there was a greater silence upon the house, it helped to separate the Shabbat from the rest of the days. It helped to say, even if it's in the physical, it was a reminder. No, this is a different day. There's something different about today. This is a day that's set apart from the rest of the week so that we can rest from the week. So that was important, but even more so, what the silence convinced me and taught me, what it showed me, was how much background noise I'm constantly bombarding myself with. Now, part of this actually comes because when I work, I actually like background noise when I'm working. I like to have, it helps me because by having to deliberately focus on blocking that out, it helps me narrow in on whatever the task is before me. 2 years ago when I was writing my dissertation for my doctoral program, the entire dissertation was written listening to classical and instrumental like spa music because it helps me focus in my writing when I do that. So that's something I do, but I allow all this background noise there. And what really impressed upon me this morning as I was thinking about the silence I was sitting in It made me begin to question, though, how often might I be drowning out the voice of God and not hearing what I need to hear both individually and as a minister in order to serve him better? I place all these distractions around me, but if I cast them by this today, casting it aside on the Shabbat, it helped me realize that actually, not just on the Shabbat, but throughout the week, I probably need to make sure that there's times that I set aside so that I can better hear his voice and I can hear him speaking to me. When you think about those encounters that the men and the women of the Bible had with God, they were probably a lot more just open to hearing his voice because they didn't have all this background noise. They didn't have the electronics. You're a shepherd out there watching over the sheep. Other than the bleating of the sheep, when they're baying and, maybe the wind blowing or, maybe when the wild animal comes, you hear that. It's dead silence. You're out there with just you and your mind and with God. And there's this greater opportunity that if God decides to speak to you during that time, you're going to hear it. You're more likely you're going to hear him. You're going to hear what he has to say. This is the importance of, Michael's taught on this several times, of the wilderness and that wilderness experience and getting out away from everything where you can hear God, where you are more likely, you're more open to hearing God's voice. And this is only one example of what I hope are many of the lessons that the Holy Spirit has been teaching us today as we have set this day apart to keep the Shabbat holy. Because if we are to move beyond that outer court, simply being in that outer court, where we know Yeshua has made it possible for anyone who accepts the sacrifice, if we want to move beyond that, we got to get to the bronze altar, and we have to examine ourselves in the mirror of that laver. We have to do this so that we can properly prepare and equip ourselves to enter into that holy place where there is only service and there is only worship to God. And we are able to dwell in his light. We're able to approach the holiness of God without that trepidation of divine judgment and wrath that we see so many times the people in the scriptures fall in fear of. But rather than having to worry about that fear, if we've accepted the sacrifice and if we've done the self-examination and washed ourselves clean, then we can go into his presence, into his service, and into his worship with rejoicing. And it'll be as though we are in his presence as it was in the garden before the fall, that presence in his light that Adam and Eve experienced, and it's going to be just as it will be in the New Jerusalem. Let us therefore continually set our minds on the holy, and remember that we should do all deeds in the name of Yeshua. We close thus with Colossians 3:1-12 and 12-17.
If then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns, and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Yeshua, giving thanks to God the Father through him.
Amen. It's our duty to praise the Master of all, to ascribe greatness to the author of creation, for he made us unlike the nations of the lands, and has not placed us like the families of the earth. He has not made our portion like theirs, or our lot like all their multitudes. And we bend the knee and bow and acknowledge our thanks before the King over kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. He stretches out heaven, establishes earth's foundation, the seat of his glory is in the heavens above, and the presence of his power is in the most exalted heights. He is our God, there is none other. True is our King, there is nothing beside him. As it is written in his Torah, and you shall know this day and take to your heart that the Lord, he is God, in the heavens above and on the earth below, there is none other.